Hey guys, tonight we embark on a journey into the heart of the forgotten gods of Greek mythology, those divine beings whose names have slipped into the shadows of history, rarely spoken or remembered. Now, you might be wondering how you've never heard of this particular god. It's like meeting a stranger in a crowded room, only to realize they've been sitting in the back corner all along. You probably won't survive the drama of this one, but I promise it'll be a cozy trip. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment below to let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. As you settle in, let's wander together through the halls of Olympus, but not the parts you're used to. You might recognize the usual gods: Zeus, Hera, Apollo, those gods who throw lightning bolts and sit on thrones. But tonight, we're going deeper into the forgotten corners, where a particular god hides in silence. He's a quiet god, a bit like the cousin you always forget is coming over to the family dinner. This god, whose name may never have crossed your mind, didn't have grand temples built in his honor. There are no epic sagas about his feats of strength or clever tricks. His story is, in a word, tragic and entirely overlooked. He's the god of things that don't get noticed, the unseen forces at work in the world. He's not one of those gods whose stories you'll hear shouted in the grand halls of Olympus, but one whose presence is felt in the background, lurking like the soft hum of an old refrigerator in the kitchen. So, let's start with a bit of background. This god was no ordinary deity. He wasn't a warrior, nor a lover of fame. No, he was the god of the quiet, the unsung, the things that make the world turn, but are never given a second thought. If you're ever walking through a forest and you feel a light breeze touch your skin, you can thank him. If you've ever felt a sudden, inexplicable tug on your heart during a moment of deep thought, that's him too. He's the god of the forces that guide life and death, yet go unnoticed. People might think it's the wind, or perhaps their own imagination, but, in truth, it's him, silently at work. Some scholars still argue whether he was a titan or a god of lesser rank, but what's clear is that his fate was not one of grandeur. His power was quiet, invisible to the eye, but felt by all. Unlike his brothers and sisters, who were often in the limelight, wielding their powers for all to see, this god wasn't about the big show. No, his true nature was more akin to a quiet night where nothing happens, yet everything feels right. Picture it: you're lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, and all seems still. That's the essence of his domain. A god who didn't need to be seen to be powerful. But there's a twist to this story, and of course, it involves betrayal. Because what is a story without a little drama, right? In this case, it was a betrayal by his very own brother, one of the more famous gods of Olympus. The one you probably already know too well. Zeus. Ah yes, the mighty Zeus, the king of the gods. With his thunderbolts and dramatic flair, Zeus was always the life of the party. But his brother, the quiet one, never quite got the attention he deserved. You know how some people think they're the best at everything? That was Zeus. He had everything: the power, the followers, the flashy persona. But when it came time to share the spotlight with his lesser-known brother, Zeus turned his back. Perhaps it was jealousy, perhaps just a lack of understanding, but Zeus left his sibling to fade into obscurity. Imagine this: you've been working in the background for years, keeping everything in balance, ensuring that all those tiny, invisible forces are functioning just as they should. And then one day, your brother, the one who's always gotten the most attention, comes in, takes all the glory, and forgets to even acknowledge the quiet, steady work you've done. That's how this god must have felt forgotten, overlooked. A mere whisper in the wind. Yet, despite being left in the shadows, he didn't give up on his role. He quietly continued doing what he did best, guiding the unseen forces that kept Olympus and the world in balance. You could say he was like the backstage crew at a concert, keeping everything running smoothly while the lead singers take all the applause. Now, let's pause for a moment and consider something interesting. There's a little-known myth about this god that raises an eyebrow or two. Some versions of his story claim that he was the first to use a mysterious power that no other god could master, the ability to influence human emotions without them knowing. Imagine if you could make someone feel an overwhelming sense of calm simply by being near them, or perhaps stir up their deepest fears with a mere glance. That was his power. And you know what? Some even say that it was he who influenced many of the greatest tragedies in Greek mythology, not through brute force, but by subtly shifting the course of human emotions and thoughts. Quite a terrifying thought, isn't it? The god who could manipulate your mind without you ever realizing it. Like trying to text Zeus, but suddenly feeling incredibly anxious for no reason at all. But his story doesn't end with quiet suffering. No, there's a peculiar twist. Eventually, this forgotten god began to change the rules of the game. Instead of remaining in the shadows, accepting his fate as the unnoticed deity, he sought out a way to influence Olympus in his own way. Some say he tried to tip the scales of fate itself, using his subtle powers to nudge the other gods into doing things they would never have otherwise. It's like that feeling when you're trying to get a friend to change their mind about something, but they're too stubborn to realize you've been guiding their choices all along. He began to orchestrate moments of doubt, pushing Zeus and others into decisions they hadn't planned. Some say he created chaos, but it was all very subtle. After all, chaos, when done correctly, should feel like a quiet disruption, like the stirring of a storm you don't even know is coming until it's too late. But, like all tragic stories, his fate took a darker turn. Instead of finding peace in his quiet rebellion, this god's influence eventually began to erode the very thing he had spent centuries trying to protect, the balance of the world. Perhaps, in his quest for recognition, he crossed a line, one that even the gods could not ignore. You settled deeper into your blankets, the soft hum of the fan setting the pace for this next part of the journey. As we continue, remember the quiet, invisible god we've just met. Well, tonight we're not quite done with his story yet. This god, once the keeper of the unseen forces that held the world together, found himself in a peculiar predicament. He wasn't merely forgotten, he was actively erased. You know how some things seem so important in the moment but fade away so quietly that it's as if they never mattered. That's how the gods of Olympus started treating him. It wasn't just a simple oversight. It was deliberate, a godly attempt to bury his existence. Imagine waking up one day and realizing that the whole world, even your own family, has forgotten you. You try to shout your name, but it falls on deaf ears. You try to make your mark, but the ground is already occupied. No matter how hard you push, nothing budges. His role, so vital and yet so subtle, was lost to time, slipping through the cracks like sand sifting through fingers. Yet, there was still a glimmer of defiance in this god's heart. It's like when you're halfway through the night and your mind races with all the things you've forgotten to do. The feeling of something slipping away and not being able to stop it, no matter how much you wish to. This God's story wasn't over yet, but it was heading into darker waters. But the gods, in all their divine wisdom, couldn't erase him completely. Some say that when a god's influence on the world is so profound, it leaves a trace, no matter how hard others try to wipe it away. He was the god of those moments that feel like they came out of nowhere, those rare instances when the world seems to bend or shift in ways we can't explain. Ever had that feeling when you're about to make an important decision and suddenly it feels like the universe is pushing you in a certain direction? That's him, that subtle whisper, like the breeze rustling through the trees just before a storm. The problem was that he had become too integral to the balance of the cosmos for the other gods to completely ignore him. After all, someone had to keep the gears of the world turning, even if no one remembered to say thank you. So, they tried something else, a trap of sorts. Instead of acknowledging his power, they reduced him to mere legend, a whisper in the background of greater, louder stories. The gods pretended he was nothing more than a myth, a story told to amuse children, leaving him with no followers, no temples, no divine legacy. The only acknowledgement of his existence was a fleeting mention in the most obscure texts. Just a name on a list of forgotten gods, buried beneath centuries of more important stories. But let's take a step back, just for a moment. You know how there are rumors about the most famous people, whispers that say they're not as perfect as they seem. It's like that with the gods. You've heard of Zeus and his thunderbolts, right? Big, bold, dramatic. But in his wake, there were gods like this, one quiet, reserved, who didn't want to cause a scene but were no less important. And you might not know this, but there are still debates among scholars and mythologists about the true nature of this god's role in shaping the fate of mortals. Some believe that he was, in fact, the original creator of fate itself, an odor, quieter force that the Olympians themselves may have feared. You see, when the gods created fate, it wasn't just an abstract concept. It was a force that could change the course of time, bending the very laws of nature. This god's involvement with fate wasn't loud or flashy. Instead, it was subtle, like a ripple in a pond that eventually spreads across the entire surface. Some even argue that this god was responsible for the tragic twists in the lives of the heroes you've heard about in other myths. What if every time Achilles was fated to die at Troy or Odysseus struggled to return home, it was this god pulling the invisible strings? This idea makes sense when you consider the unseen forces he was linked to. However, because of his quiet nature, there's no consensus on this. Some scholars brush it off as myth, others debate whether his true role was hidden beneath layers of folklore. It's one of those historical debates where the answer might never be clear. Still, this god's power was never truly wiped out. You know how even the most hidden things still find their way to the surface. A shadow can only be ignored for so long before it demands attention. Just like the minor details in a story that seem insignificant at first but eventually turn out to be crucial. This god's presence couldn't stay silent forever. There are accounts that suggest the more the gods tried to bury him, the more they found their lives intertwined with his influence. When they needed calm, when the winds were too strong or the storms too wild, he was there quietly shaping the balance. The gods realized too late that his disappearance was not just an erasure of a name, it was a disruption in the very fabric of reality. But before we get lost in all these divine debates and theories, let's pause to look at one of the more unusual details of this god's quiet existence. You may have heard the myth about Pandora's box, that it unleashed all the evils of the world. But did you know that it was this god who supposedly kept the last thing hidden in the box? Hope. When Pandora opened that box, hope was the last to remain, tucked away in a corner, just as quiet and unobtrusive as this god. In some versions of the myth, it's suggested that this god had a hand in hiding hope, making sure that, even in the darkest times, there was a whisper of possibility. Hope, like his power, was always there, but you had to look for it, and often it was too subtle to see. And that's the thing about this god. You might not notice him at first, but he's always there, like the background hum of a song that carries you through the night. He exists in the quiet moments, the ones we often overlook. And his role, while never celebrated, is as essential as the air we breathe. So, while Zeus and Apollo bask in the glory of their feats, let's not forget the silent god who, in the shadows, guides the forces that keep everything in balance. As his story unfolds, it becomes clear. Despite all efforts to silence him, this god wasn't gone. He was simply waiting for the right moment, the right time to be remembered again. Now, as you settle even deeper into your space, your mind drifting like the softest breeze through ancient Greece, the story of this forgotten god becomes even more mysterious. As we explore further, you might begin to wonder if he was so quiet, so overlooked, how did he still manage to leave his mark on the world? It's a good question, and one that requires a closer look. After all, when you're living in a world full of thunderbolts and chariots, it can be hard to imagine a god who simply stays in the background, doing his work with no fanfare, no loud declarations. But that's exactly what made him so powerful and so dangerous. You know how sometimes the quietest person in a room is the one who holds all the answers? That's the kind of god we're talking about. One whose influence is so subtle that you don't even notice it until it's too late. Imagine a power so deep, so integral to everything, that it could shift the tides of fate without anyone ever realizing it. That was this god's gift, the ability to alter things at the most fundamental level, quietly guiding the course of history with just a breath. The gods of Olympus, of course, never gave him the respect he deserved, constantly looking down on him for his lack of outward grandeur. Zeus might have ruled with thunder, Poseidon with oceans, and Athena with wisdom, but this god, he ruled over the unseen, the things that people couldn't grasp or name, like the quiet pull of the moon that causes the tides to shift. Some say he was the embodiment of the small, unseen forces of nature, those forces that work behind the scenes, like the wind that stirs your hair without you ever knowing where it came from. His role was in the fabric of everything, from the tiniest leaf that fell in a distant forest to the most tragic fates of heroes. Remember the myth of Oedipus, the one where a king unknowingly kills his father and marries his mother. A tale of fate, yes, but some scholars argue that the twists in that myth weren't entirely of the god's making. Some even believe that it was this god who influenced the subtle twists of Oedipus's destiny, nudging him in ways that even he couldn't comprehend. It's like when you're walking down the street and the tiniest change in direction, just the smallest shift in your feet, suddenly leads you to bump into someone you never expected. That was the power this god had, influencing the world in such a way that it seemed almost accidental. The gods of Olympus never understood just how much they relied on him. They ignored him, thinking his subtle influence was unimportant, but in doing so, they unwittingly invited disaster. So, what happens when the forces of fate themselves start to break down? When the unseen god who holds everything together begins to stretch thin, as if his powers are fraying at the edges? That's when things start to go wrong. The gods, in their arrogance, never thought to honor him so. Why would they expect him to protect them when disaster struck? And when it did strike, it came in the form of a rebellion. The quiet god, who had been fading into obscurity, decided that it was finally time to make his presence known. It's like a small creek that's been quietly flowing for centuries. And suddenly, there's a dam break, sending the waters rushing through the land. But unlike Zeus' thunder, this wasn't a loud, violent rebellion. No, it was much more insidious. It was the subtlety of things gone wrong in the smallest ways, the broken promises, the shifts in power that seemed to come out of nowhere, the sudden deaths of heroes who were supposed to live forever. The more the gods ignored him, the more they began to see his power at work in ways they couldn't understand. It wasn't like the stories they told about Zeus smiting giants or Athena outwitting the Titans. No, this god didn't need to make a scene. His power lay in things that couldn't be measured. Imagine trying to measure the wind in a forest. Impossible, right? You can't see it, but you feel it. That's how his influence worked. It's like that feeling when you're on the edge of sleep, and suddenly a small sound unnoticed, creak in the floor, or a distant car passing by pulls you back into full consciousness, forcing you to acknowledge something you didn't even know was there. That was the mark this god left on the world, a persistent reminder that no force, no matter how quiet, is ever truly gone. But there's another interesting twist to this god story that not many people know. You see, while the gods of Olympus were busy ignoring him, they failed to notice that this god's influence wasn't just limited to their realm. He had quietly infiltrated the mortal world as well. It's like that time when you thought you were going to a quiet dinner party, only to realize that there was someone there who had an uncanny ability to turn the conversation in a completely unexpected direction. Some myths suggest that he had a role in guiding the fates of mortals who, like him, were lost in obscurity. Take, for example, the tragic story of Arachne. Remember her? A mortal who dared to challenge Athena to a weaving contest and was turned into a spider for her arrogance. Some versions of the myth suggest that it wasn't Athena who caused Arachne's downfall. Instead, it was this god who, from the shadows, nudged Arachne into making her fateful challenge. It's as if he was the unseen hand that guided her, ever so subtly, towards her tragic end. You could say that this god had a knack for finding people who were destined to slip through the cracks of history. People like Arachne, who were forgotten by the gods, but still influenced by the powers of fate. Now, let's return to the gods of Olympus for a moment. As they began to realize that their fate was slipping through their fingers, they did what gods do best. They tried to fix the problem, but by then it was too late. The forgotten god had already woven his influence into the fabric of their lives, and no amount of divine intervention could erase it. Some say that even the great war of the gods, the Titanomachy, was partly his doing. After all, how could such a war happen without the influence of unseen forces? Even the grandest battles of the gods may have been nudged along by this quiet god, whose actions could never be traced, but whose effects were undeniable. It's like that odd sensation when you hear a faint song in the background, but it sticks with you long after the music has stopped. You never saw it coming, but it changed everything. As we drift deeper into the tale, it's clear that this god wasn't just a forgotten figure. No, he was the subtle force that held everything together, the quiet pulse in the heart of Olympus. And in his silence, he shaped the world in ways the gods would never understand. By now, you're beginning to feel the weight of the world around this forgotten god. You're wrapped up in his story, almost like he's subtly pulling you deeper into his web, making you feel the quiet hum of his existence in a way that's almost comforting, but there's still more to uncover. Imagine a God so powerful, so deeply embedded in the fabric of life, that even when the other gods tried to completely wipe him out of existence, he continued to affect the world in ways that even they could never comprehend. It's like that quiet hum of a song you can't quite place, but you find yourself humming along to anyway. This God, despite being ignored, overshadowed, and deliberately erased, held within him the key to the universe's deepest workings. He was the secret to understanding the delicate balance of all things, yet nobody bothered to learn his name. If you think about it, it's almost poetic, isn't it? A God whose power lies in the fact that he never needed to be seen. His influence was so seamless, so quiet, that it wasn't recognized as a force at all, until one day, everything began to fall apart. Think of it like when you suddenly realize something's wrong with your phone, only to find out it was a slow decline you didn't notice. A little glitch that crept up without you knowing. That's how the gods must have felt, as this God's absence began to expose the cracks in their reign. Without his gentle influence to keep things in balance, chaos began to rise, silently and unnoticed, like the tide coming in at night. But how did it all unravel? Well, the truth is, the gods didn't see their downfall coming. They believed that their power was absolute, that they could control everything from the smallest grain of sand to the stars themselves. Yet, without this God's invisible hand subtly guiding the flow of things, the entire system of the cosmos began to break apart. It's like trying to drive a car with no oil loo. Don't notice it until the engine stalls. That's how deeply intertwined this God was with the forces of nature. He was the keeper of harmony, the thread that wove the universe's chaos into a beautiful, intricate tapestry. When he was forgotten, the tapestry began to fray. The gods of Olympus, whose lives were filled with drama and spectacle, never considered how important the unseen was. They looked at the visible power of the lightning bolts, the oceans, the wisdom, and thought it was enough. They never thought that it was the smallest forces that were keeping everything together. And that's where the rebellion came in. You've probably heard of many great rebellions, right? One where the people rise up, angry and loud, and overthrow their oppressors, with a great show of power. But this was different. This rebellion was silent. It wasn't a shout of defiance. It was a whisper, one that turned into a murmur, then into a roar. The more the gods ignored the subtle God's influence, the more the world began to slip into chaos. It's like when you're trying to ignore a nagging feeling, pretending it doesn't exist, but the longer you push it down, the harder it gets to breathe. The gods were suffocating under the weight of their own arrogance. They assumed that because they had the thunderbolts, the waves, and the wisdom, nothing else mattered. They forgot the importance of those small, unnoticed actions, the quiet forces that kept the world in balance. Now, as the chaos began to unfold, it wasn't just the gods who felt it. The mortal world too was deeply affected. Have you ever felt like you're walking on a tightrope, just waiting for the smallest misstep to send you tumbling down? That's how the world felt when the forces of nature started to shift. The gods, who were used to controlling everything, like marionettes pulling at the strings of life, began to lose their grip. The earth started to tremble, the sky darkened, and the tides rose and fell in strange, unpredictable patterns. You could almost hear the whispers of the forgotten God in the wind, as if he was reminding everyone, gods and mortals alike, that the smallest forces have the power to alter the course of everything. What's even more interesting is the way this god's rebellion played out. Remember how I told you that he was a master of subtlety? Well, his rebellion wasn't a grand act of violence. It wasn't a show of strength, but a quiet undoing of the laws of nature that the gods had relied on. You know that feeling when you're doing something really important, and then, just when you think everything's fine, you realize you forgot to do one small thing. That's what this rebellion felt like, an oversight, a missing piece, something so small that it's almost imperceptible. And yet, it caused everything to unravel. The gods began to realize they couldn't stop the tide of change that this forgotten god had set in motion. As they tried to put things back together, they found their power slipping through their fingers. Every attempt they made to correct the world's course only seemed to make things worse. It was as if the very fabric of existence had shifted, and the gods had no way of stitching it back together. It's like when you're trying to repair something that's broken. But every time you fix one part, another piece falls apart. That was the gods' plight. No matter what they did, the system they had relied on was breaking down. And you know who was watching it all? The quiet god. The one who had been waiting, watching from the shadows, content in his role as the invisible force holding everything together. Now, it seemed, his time had come to rise, not with a dramatic outburst, but with a subtle shift that would change everything. As this rebellion unfolded, some began to speculate that the forgotten god wasn't just rebelling out of spite or revenge. No, some believed that his actions were guided by something deeper, an understanding that the gods needed to learn a lesson. Perhaps it was a lesson in humility, a reminder that no matter how powerful you are, there are forces at work that you cannot control. Some scholars still argue whether the rebellion was an act of divine justice or simply the natural consequences of ignoring the quiet god's power for too long. But in the end, it didn't matter. What mattered was the change that was coming. The world, both mortal and divine, was on the brink of something new. As the dust settled and the gods began to comprehend the extent of their mistakes, they realized that it was too late to undo the damage. The balance had been shifted, and they were no longer the all-powerful rulers they once thought themselves to be. Their reign, once so secure, had been destabilized by the very forces they had overlooked. And in that destabilization, the forgotten god stood, not as a victor, but as a quiet reminder that even the smallest forces can change the course of everything. As the world around you seems to fade into a deeper, quieter place, the story of this forgotten god takes another, more somber turn. You feel yourself drifting into the tale, not just as a listener, but as a quiet observer in this ancient world, watching the gods and mortals grapple with the consequences of their actions, or rather, their inactions. The time for the gods to make amends was growing shorter by the moment. But as you know, the divine world isn't one that easily bends to mercy. Instead of a peaceful resolution, what followed was a series of disjointed attempts by the gods to restore their former glory. It's like trying to fix an old watch, but no matter how many times you rewind it, the hands just won't move in sync. The gods thought they could simply erase the absence of the quiet god from their lives, as if it were just a fleeting shadow that would disappear when the sun rose high enough. They failed to realize that, much like the shifting winds or the ocean tides, his absence was no longer something they could ignore. This god's influence was so deeply woven into the very fabric of existence that to erase him was to tear apart the world they had built. And so, the gods began to panic. But their panic, like their arrogance, was another force that played into the hands of fate. Picture it, You're on the edge of sleep, fighting to stay awake, and the more you try to resist, the harder it becomes to keep your eyes open. The gods struggled to undo their mistakes, became increasingly futile, just as futile as trying to hold on to a dream that's slipping away. But the most striking thing about this quiet god's role is that, even in their panic, the other gods never fully understood the power he had over them. Some of them, like Apollo and Artemis, tried to appeal to him, attempting to reason with the forces they could no longer control. But how do you reason with the wind? How do you convince the ocean to behave? This god's powers, though subtle, were inextricably linked to the unseen forces that kept all things in balance. By the time the gods realized what they had done, by the time they saw the cracks in the world begin to widen, they were already too far gone. There was no going back. The moment of reckoning had arrived, and all they could do now was wait and see how the consequences of their inaction would play out. Imagine that sinking feeling when you know something bad is coming, but you can't quite stop it. The gods were trapped in that same feeling. The quiet god had been their shadow, the invisible hand that helped guide the paths they walked. Yet, as they scrambled to regain control, they failed to see that their very attempts to undo the damage were feeding into it. You know how sometimes you make a small mistake, and you think you can cover it up, but the more you try, the bigger the mess becomes. That was what the gods were doing. Every act of interference, every attempt to right their wrongs, only caused more chaos. They were trying to fix the world, but in doing so, they only deepened the fracture. But the most fascinating thing about this god's influence was his lack of desire for revenge. Oh, the gods feared that. They feared he would rise up and strike them down, like some of the darker gods of Greek myth. But no, the quiet god had no such interest. His rebellion wasn't about inflicting pain, it was about balance, about the forces that guided the world returning to their rightful place. It was about showing the gods that their hubris, their belief that they could control everything, had consequences. And in a way, this god's vengeance wasn't in the form of wrath. No, his vengeance was much quieter than that. It was a soft whisper in the wind, a slight tug on the strings of fate. Instead of striking down the gods with thunder or fire, he let their actions unravel slowly, just like a frayed piece of string that, no matter how hard you try to fix it, simply cannot be made whole again. But let's pause for a moment, shall we? Now, you might be wondering, if this god had the power to influence the gods in such profound ways, then why didn't he just take control of everything? Why didn't he simply seize the throne of Olympus and reign supreme? Well, here's the twist. This god didn't want to rule. He didn't desire power, or fame, or worship. His power was quiet, subtle, and infinitely patient. Unlike Zeus, whose ego often demanded the spotlight, or Athena, whose wisdom was as sharp as her spear, this god's influence worked best when it was barely noticed at all. It's like a slow rain that falls unnoticed by most, but it nourishes the earth in ways you can't always see. And so, this god wasn't about claiming the throne. He was about restoring the balance that the gods had disrupted, and perhaps showing them that sometimes the quietest forces are the ones that keep the universe in motion. The more the gods fought to reverse what had already been done, the more they realized that the forces they had once taken for granted could no longer be controlled. Like trying to hold on to a dream, they found that their attempts only made it more elusive. They tried to mend the world with their usual power, Zeus with his thunder, Apollo with his light, but the more they used their powers, the worse things seemed to get. Chaos began to spread in every corner of the earth. The seasons no longer followed their natural course. Crops withered under the sun, and the very seas seemed to shift in ways that defied explanation. Mortals, too, felt the effects of the gods' negligence. The winds carried whispers of strange omens, and the gods themselves began to feel the unease that had spread through Olympus. And this is where it becomes fascinating. In the midst of all this chaos, the forgotten god remained an enigma. No one knew where he was or how he was affecting the world. All they knew was that they were feeling the weight of his absence in ways they never could have imagined. As the gods struggled to reclaim their lost power, they realized that it wasn't simply their world that was slipping from their grasp, it was the very essence of existence itself. The threads that held the cosmos together were coming undone. This god's subtle rebellion had not only changed their world, it had changed the course of time itself. No longer would the gods of Olympus sit upon their thrones without understanding the quiet forces that kept the world in check. At the end of this story, the gods were left with nothing but their broken thrones, their shattered illusions, and the quiet, unspoken truth that some forces are too powerful to control. The forgotten god didn't need to make a loud statement, and he certainly didn't need to be worshipped. His presence was enough, quietly and patiently waiting for the moment when the gods would finally understand. You might have thought that the gods' struggles had reached their climax, that the quiet god had made his point and the gods had learned their lesson. But no, my friend, the story doesn't end there. Not by a long shot. As the world continued to reel from the consequences of their neglect, the gods were left with a singular truth. Their power was no longer absolute. The balance, which they had always taken for granted, was now slipping through their fingers like sand in an hourglass. And yet, the forgotten god remained elusive, never once revealing himself, never once claiming his rightful place in the halls of Olympus. It was as if he was simply watching from the shadows, waiting to see how the gods would respond to their mistakes. And they responded in the only way they knew how, by attempting to reclaim control in a world where control no longer existed. As you continue to drift through this tale, let's pause for a moment and think about what's happening here. The gods, once so certain in their rule, were being forced to face the reality of their fragility. They weren't invincible after all, and perhaps they never had been. They thought they could control every aspect of life, from birth to death, from the sun to the moon. But in reality, there were forces in the world, quiet, unseen forces, that even the mightiest of gods couldn't control. This is the point where the gods finally begin to realize that their failure to recognize the subtlety of the forgotten god's power was the ultimate mistake. It wasn't their thunderbolts, or their chariots, or their wisdom that held the world together. It was the invisible, unnoticed forces, the ones they couldn't see, that truly governed the balance of the universe. As you settle in a little deeper, the tale grows darker, and you can almost feel the weight of the gods' realization pressing down on them. What do you do when you've spent centuries thinking you're invincible, only to find out that your entire existence is built on an illusion? That was the gods' plight. They didn't want to admit it, but it was clear. They had been too blinded by their power to notice the quiet god slipping through their grasp. And now, with the world in chaos, they realized that everything they had worked for was coming undone. It's like when you spend hours building something beautiful, only to have it fall apart because you didn't pay attention to the smallest details. The gods had built a world of grandeur, but in doing so, they ignored the tiny threads that held it all together. And now, those threads were unraveling. The forgotten god, ever elusive, was watching all of this unfold with a patient, knowing gaze. He didn't need to do anything. He didn't need to raise his hand or summon a storm. All he had to do was exist in his quiet, subtle way, and the gods would do the rest. The chaos they were witnessing wasn't some grand act of vengeance. No. It was simply the natural order of things returning to balance. The gods had ignored the delicate equilibrium of the world for far too long, and now they were paying the price. They could fight it, they could attempt to reclaim control, but in the end, the forgotten god's influence was like the pull of the ocean. Tide it was inevitable. You've probably heard the saying, what goes up must come down. Well, the gods had risen too high, and now it was time for them to fall. As the world fell into disarray, the gods scrambled to find a solution, but no matter what they did, the influence of the quiet god could not be reversed. It was as if their actions were mere drops in an ocean, insignificant in the face of the tide that was already rolling in. The very things they had taken for granted, the seasons, the sun, the winds, began to turn against them. The natural cycles they had once controlled so easily now seemed beyond their reach. You know that feeling when you think you've got everything figured out, only to have it slip away from you in an instant. That's how the gods must have felt. They had spent millennia playing the game of life, but now the rules had changed. And they were no longer the ones holding the cards. The more they fought against the chaos, the more they realized that it was a fight they couldn't win. Some gods, like Hera, tried to rally the others to restore some semblance of order, but their efforts were futile. Every action they took seemed to make the situation worse, as if the very fabric of reality was shifting beneath their feet. It's like when you're walking on a tightrope, and the more you try to regain your balance, the more you end up tipping to one side. That's what the gods were doing. Their attempts to fix things only caused further disruption. But here's the truly fascinating part. Some gods, in their desperation, turned to the forgotten god, seeking his forgiveness. They knew they couldn't undo what they had done, but perhaps they could find a way to work with the forces he controlled to bring balance back to the world. Zeus, the mighty ruler of Olympus, was among those who sought him out. It wasn't a grand plea, mind you. There were no thunderbolts or divine proclamations. Instead, it was a quiet, humble requester, recognition of the power that the gods had so long ignored. It was the first time in history that the gods had acknowledged the importance of the unseen forces that held everything together. They were finally beginning to understand that their power was not limitless, that their reign was not secure. The quiet god had shown them that there was always something bigger than their petty squabbles and their divine thrones. So, what happened next? Did the gods learn their lesson? Did they reconcile with the forgotten god, or did they continue their struggle for dominance? The truth is, we'll never fully know. The gods were creatures of pride, after all. But as you lie here, drifting through this myth, one thing becomes clear. Sometimes, the most powerful forces are the ones we can't see, and the most important things are often the ones we overlook. The forgotten god, in his quiet rebellion, showed the gods and us that everything, no matter how powerful, is fragile. And in his absence, the gods had learned one of the most important lessons of all, that the smallest forces are often the most powerful. You might think that, by now, the gods would have come to terms with their mistakes, that they would have fully understood the weight of their actions and the consequences of their negligence toward the quiet god. But as you settle deeper into this narrative, the story takes yet another twist, one that pulls you further into the intricacies of fate and the cost of divine arrogance. Despite the gods' recognition of their failure, their desire for control remained undiminished, and this is where the true beauty of the quiet god's role becomes evident. His story, woven into the fabric of their lives, was not one of brute force or violent upheaval. No, it was one of delicate influence, the kind that shapes the course of events over time, like the slow wearing of a stone by a persistent stream. But what the gods failed to realize was that this quiet god's influence extended beyond the realms of Olympus. His power wasn't confined to the heavens or the earth. It reached into the hearts of mortals as well. You know how a small change in your life, a decision, a moment can set off a chain of events that you never expected. That was the kind of power this god held. The gods, in their selfish pursuit of dominion, had failed to see that the balance of the world depended not just on their own actions, but on the subtle forces they could not control. It's like trying to stop the wind from blowing. No matter how much you wish it would cease, it continues its course, indifferent to your desires. This god understood that. He embodied it. His power lay in the things you couldn't see, but always felt: the breath of a passing wind, the rhythm of the tides, the invisible thread that connected everything in the world. The gods tried to control the heavens and earth, but they couldn't control the wind. As the gods scrambled to rebuild their broken world, they began to see the depth of their error. It wasn't just the world around them that was falling apart. It was their very existence, their divine essence, that was threatened. They had taken for granted their ability to influence the world, to bend fate to their will. But now they found themselves powerless in the face of something far greater than their thunderbolts, their wisdom, or their beauty. The quiet god had woven himself so deeply into the fabric of existence that removing him wasn't just a matter of erasing a name from the records. It was like trying to take a single thread out of a tapestry without unraveling the entire thing. Each god, in their arrogance, had assumed that their influence alone was what kept the world running. But now, they saw that they were merely one part of a much greater whole, a whole that was dependent on forces that they could not comprehend or control. It's a humbling thought, isn't it? Imagine the gods, so proud and mighty, coming to the realization that they were not the ultimate arbiters of the world they ruled. They were just pieces in a much larger puzzle. Some of them, like Apollo, couldn't help but express their frustration. How could they have missed this? How could they have let such a subtle force slip through their fingers? How could they have been so blind to the one thing that held the universe together? They were like travelers, lost in a forest, unable to see the path ahead, yet each time they tried to move forward, they found themselves circling back to the same place. They had learned the most difficult lesson of all, that no matter how much power they held, there were forces beyond their control. But the gods, as stubborn as they were, didn't just accept this fate. They didn't simply roll over and surrender to the quiet god's influence. Instead, they began to seek out ways to regain control, to tip the balance back in their favor. They turned to their old ally Zech. Otharan began to scheme. Zeus, the mighty king of the gods, tried to rally his siblings, to unite them. In their cause to restore order, Hera, with her unwavering loyalty to her family, pledged to do whatever it took to fix the world. But their efforts, once so powerful, now seemed futile. Every time they tried to take back control, the balance tipped further out of reach. The gods were trapped in their own hubris, their desire for dominance leading them further down a path of frustration. At the same time, the quiet god continued his work, not with grand gestures or dramatic displays, but with the smallest of nudges. He didn't need to strike the gods down. His power lay in the way the world shifted, the way people began to feel, as though they were no longer in control of their own destinies. Think about it. How often do you think you're in charge of your life, only to find that life has a way of pushing you in directions you never expected? That's what this god did. He guided the flow of fate, not by force, but by subtle manipulation. He was the wind at your back when you thought you were walking on your own. And the gods, for all their power, couldn't stop it. They tried, of course. They attempted to push the world back into the shape they wanted, but with each failed attempt, they only found themselves deeper in the chaos they had created. But in the midst of their failures, something changed. Some of the gods began to understand the lesson the quiet god had been trying to teach them all along. Perhaps it wasn't about control. Perhaps it wasn't about bending fate to their will. Perhaps true power lay in understanding the world's delicate balance and accepting that sometimes the greatest strength is in knowing when to let go. It's like the practice of letting go of control when you're holding on to something too tightly. When you stop forcing it, you find that things begin to move naturally. The gods slowly began to realize that their fight for dominance had only disrupted the balance that had kept the world in harmony for so long. They had to stop fighting the current and let themselves be carried along by it. As they learned this, the world began to heal. Slowly, quietly, the gods stopped resisting the flow of fate and began to work with it. The quiet god's influence, once seen as a curse, now became a lesson in humility. The gods realized that no matter how great their power, they were part of something much larger, something that they couldn't control. They began to accept their place in the universe, not as rulers of all, but as stewards of a greater, unseen order. And as they did, the world began to heal. The seasons returned to their rightful place. The winds blew gently once again, and the gods, for the first time in ages, could rest knowing that the quiet god had shown them the way. And so, the quiet god, though never fully acknowledged, had changed the course of Olympus. His influence, woven into the fabric of the universe, reminded the gods that even the smallest forces are the ones that truly shape the world. The gods may have been powerful, but they were not all powerful. And in that realization, they found peace. As the gods began to settle into this newfound peace, the world took on a quieter, more serene form, but that serenity was not born from their power or their glory. It was born from a humbler understanding that they were not alone in this world, nor were they the masters of it. The quiet god, whose name had been forgotten by most, had woven himself so deeply into the very essence of life that his presence was now as essential as the stars in the sky. The gods, despite their supreme status, were reminded by this unseen force that nothing is truly controlled. Everything is connected by threads that run too deep to see. It was the kind of realization that comes at the most unexpected times, like when you've been holding your breath without knowing it, only to finally exhale and realize that you were never in control of the air. The gods of Olympus had learned that control was not a divine right, but a responsibility that required the careful tending of the delicate balance between all things. And in this understanding, a strange sense of peace emerged. The gods were not defeated. They were not humbled in the traditional sense. Rather, they had learned to surrender to the flow of life, to the subtle forces that made the world turn, forces they had long ignored. Picture it. After years of holding on to the reins of power so tightly, the gods had finally let go, allowing the wind to carry them wherever it wished. There was no more struggling, no more exertion of power. Instead, the gods found themselves drifting in the current of fate, their previous actions now seen for what they truly were, part of an intricate, greater design that no one god could fully control. Even Zeus, with his mighty thunderbolts, no longer held sway over all. In the midst of this new understanding, something beautiful began to unfold. It was as if the world, and even the gods themselves had learned to breathe again. Where once there was tension and chaos, now there was a calm acceptance. The balance the gods had once believed was theirs to command was revealed to be something far more fragile, something that required them to acknowledge their place within it rather than above it. There is a lesson here that echoes through the ages, that sometimes true power is not in bending the world to your will, but in acknowledging that you were just a part of a much larger whole. And this was the quiet god's ultimate gift to the gods of Olympus. The gods, in their pursuit of perfection, had always been concerned with dominance, but dominance, as they now realized, was an illusion. True strength lay in harmony, in understanding the forces of nature and fate, and in working alongside them rather than trying to conquer them. It was like an orchestra, where the most important sound is not the loudest, but the one that blends seamlessly with the rest. As the gods embraced this lesson, the world began to reflect their newfound harmony. The winds shifted gently, the seas calmed, and the sun shone just a little brighter. The earth itself seemed to sigh with relief. Even the mortal realm, which had long been tossed about by the whims of the gods, began to find its own balance once more. Mortals no longer looked up to the sky in fear of the gods' wrath. Instead, they saw a world that worked in tandem, where the gods were no longer separate from the mortal realm, but intertwined with it. A delicate dance of existence that neither could dominate. It is here that we find the final, most poignant lesson of this story, that the forgotten god, the one who had never asked for glory or recognition, had shown the gods that true wisdom lay in quiet power. He was the force that shaped the world, not through domination, but through the subtle shifts that guide everything toward its natural end. It was never about rising to the top or outshining others. It was about existing, and existing well-like. A quiet whisper that echoes through time. A ripple in the water that continues to move long after the stone is dropped. The gods, in their newfound understanding, could see that their strength wasn't in their ability to control the world, but in their ability to harmonize with it. They no longer needed to fight for dominance. They simply needed to listen, to understand, and to respect the balance that governed everything. There's something deeply beautiful in that something peaceful. Just imagine the tranquility that would come if we, too, could learn that lesson. If we could understand that not everything needs to be controlled, that sometimes, simply being a part of the world, accepting our place within it, is enough. It's a powerful thought, one that the gods themselves had to learn the hard way. As the gods slowly adapted to this new way of being, the quiet god remained, as ever, a shadow in the background, never demanding anything, never seeking attention. His power was not in his presence, but in his absence, his quiet influence. Like a gentle breeze, you may not always feel it, but when it's gone, you notice. The gods now understood that. They understood that, for the first time in their existence, they didn't have to be the center of attention to be powerful. They didn't need to strike the world with thunder to be important. Their significance lay in their ability to support the world around them, to let it grow and flourish without interference. It was no longer about them. It was about everything, the world, the cosmos, the mortals below. And in that humility, they found their peace. The quiet god had taught them that the greatest power isn't in loud displays of strength, but in the soft whisper of change, the unnoticed yet undeniable force that shapes all things. It's a lesson that will echo for as long as there are winds to blow, tides to shift, and stars to twinkle. The gods of Olympus, once so certain in their reign, had learned their greatest lesson, that the most powerful forces are often the ones we can't see or control, and the quiet God, forever in the shadows, continued his work, his power remaining just as vital as ever. The gods, having learned their greatest lesson, stood at the crossroads of their divine journey. They could no longer deny the power of the quiet God whose subtlety had shaken their very foundations. It was a humbling realization, one that echoed through Olympus with the weight of centuries of unchecked arrogance. Imagine being at the pinnacle of your existence, with nothing left to prove, only to realize that the most essential truths were the ones you had failed to see all along. This was the burden the gods now carried. They were no longer just rulers of the heavens and earth, but participants in a much larger, interconnected web of existence. They had been reminded, through the quiet God's actions, that their dominion over the world was not an eternal right, but a responsibility that required humility and respect for the delicate balance of nature. They had learned that the power they wielded was never truly theirs to own. It was given to them, yes, but it could just as easily be taken away. It was like being handed the reins of a chariot and believing you could drive it anywhere you wanted, only to realize that the horses were more powerful than you ever imagined. The gods had long been the masters of their domain, but now, for the first time, they saw themselves as part of something much greater. They were no longer in control of everything. They were simply caretakers of a world that was larger than their understanding. This shift in perspective wasn't immediate, nor was it easy. But as the days passed and the gods grew more accustomed to their new way of thinking, they began to see the world in a different light. It wasn't about force or power. It was about finding balance, understanding the flow of life, and working with it, not against it. And yet, this was not a world of complete surrender. The gods still held immense power, but now they wielded it with a gentler hand, knowing that the balance could easily tip in the wrong direction if they pushed too hard. It was a new era for Olympus, one in which the gods learned that their greatest strength lay in their ability to adapt, to listen to the forces around them, and to respect the invisible threads that held the universe together. And at the center of it all was the quiet God, the one who had remained unnoticed for so long, yet had shaped the world in ways that no one could have predicted. His presence was subtle, but undeniable. It was the kind of power that didn't demand attention, but whose absence was felt the moment it was gone. He had never sought to be the center of the gods' world, and in that he had found his ultimate strength. The gods, as they adapted to this new reality, began to acknowledge his influence. It wasn't a grand declaration or a dramatic reconciliation. It was a quiet understanding, a mutual respect that grew over time. The gods, once so proud, had come to understand that their power was only part of the larger tapestry of existence, and that the quiet God had always been an essential part of that design. They didn't need to worship him, but they did need to honor his role. In doing so, they had come to realize something truly profound. That power, when tempered with humility and understanding, could be a force for good. And so, the gods began to work together in ways they never had before. No longer were they isolated in their thrones, each ruling over their individual domains. They had learned that their world was one of interconnected forces, where every action had a ripple effect, where every god's influence was felt by another. It was a system built on cooperation, not competition. It was a world where even the smallest forces, the ones that could be so easily ignored, were acknowledged and respected. The gods of Olympus, in their newfound understanding, began to act in harmony with the world around them. They no longer sought to impose their will on the world. Instead, they worked with the world, guiding it along its natural course. And at the center of this new era was the quiet God, whose influence was felt in every breeze, every wave, every quiet moment that passed unnoticed by the gods and mortals alike. He was the force that held everything together, not through violence or conquest, but through patience, subtlety, and an unwavering commitment to balance. The gods, once so blind to his importance, now saw him for what he truly was, the cornerstone of the universe. And as they embraced this new understanding, they found that the world began to heal. The chaos that had once threatened to tear everything apart began to recede, replaced by a gentle, steady peace. The seasons followed their natural course once more. The winds blew in harmony with the earth. The sun rose and set without resistance. The world, as it had always been, was now in balance once again, thanks to the quiet God whose presence had never truly been forgotten, only overlooked. The gods, in their humility, had learned that the greatest power was not in dominance, but in harmony. They had learned that the world did not belong to them, but to the delicate balance of all things. And so, with the quiet God watching from the shadows, the gods of Olympus entered a new era, one of peace, understanding, and respect for the forces that shaped the world. They had learned the most valuable lesson of all, that the smallest forces, when respected, are often the most powerful. And so, the gods, for the first time in their existence, could rest not because they had conquered the world, but because they had learned to live in it. They had learned to be part of the balance, not its masters. The quiet God, having shown them the way, could finally be at peace, knowing that the gods had learned the lesson he had always known, that power is not in domination, but in cooperation. As the gods basked in the newfound peace, their understanding of the universe and their place within it shifted even further. They had learned a profound truth. True power is not in dominance, but in harmony with the forces that shape the world. They had finally recognized the value of the quiet God's influence, and in doing so, they had made a subtle but powerful pact with the natural world. It was as if they had found the missing piece of a puzzle that had never quite fit before, and now the pieces were falling into place. The once fragmented, chaotic world of Olympus and Earth was now united in a delicate balance, a balance that was no longer under the control of any one god, but governed by the unseen, subtle forces that had always existed beneath the surface. It was like a symphony, where every instrument played its part in perfect harmony, each contributing to the greater whole. The gods, in their collective wisdom, understood that they were no longer the rulers of the world, but rather stewards of a much greater, interconnected system. They were still gods, with immense power, but their role had changed. They no longer sought to control the lives of mortals, to bend fate to their will. Instead, they embraced the ebb and flow of life, understanding that the world, both divine and mortal, was a dynamic force that required patience, humility, and respect. This was the true essence of power, a power that didn't need to announce itself with a loud roar or a thunderous strike. It was the power of quiet, steady influence, like the way the moon affects the tides without ever being seen. It was the power of the quiet God, who had never sought the limelight, but whose influence had been the backbone of existence all along. His role was subtle but vital, and the gods had come to understand that they, too, had a part to play in this delicate dance. They had learned to trust the natural order, to allow things to unfold in their own time, rather than forcing them into shape. With this new understanding, the gods began to work together in ways that had never been seen before. Gone were the days of competition, of one god trying to outshine another. Instead, they embraced the quiet, unseen forces that had always governed the cosmos, and in doing so, they found a newfound respect for each other and for the world they inhabited. It was as if a veil had been lifted from their eyes, and they could now see the world for what it truly was, a vast, interconnected web of life, where every action had a ripple effect, and every god's influence was felt by another. The gods, once so proud, now understood that their power was not in their ability to control everything, but in their ability to live in harmony with the world around them. They no longer saw themselves as separate from the world of mortals, but as integral parts of it. They understood that their actions, no matter how small, could affect the balance of the universe, and in that realization they found peace. The gods, as proud and mighty as they were, had finally learned to coexist, not just with each other, but with the world they ruled. And in that coexistence, they found a deeper, more profound kind of power, one that didn't seek to dominate, but to nurture, protect, and guide. They had learned the quiet god's most valuable lesson, that true strength lies not in power, but in understanding and respecting the forces that shape the world. As they sat on their thrones, no longer fighting for dominance, they realized that their role was not to control the world, but to ensure that it continued to thrive, that the balance they had learned to respect was maintained. And as they embraced this new role, the world itself seemed to respond. The earth grew fertile once more, the winds calmed, the seas became steady, and the sun shone brighter. The gods, once so certain in their superiority, had found a deeper understanding of their place in the cosmos. They had learned that their power was not an absolute force, but a part of the greater whole. And in this acceptance, they found peace, not just for themselves, but for the world they had once tried to dominate. The quiet god, who had been the catalyst for this transformation, remained in the shadows, his work done. He had no need for accolades, no need for recognition. His influence had been felt, and his message had been understood. He had taught the gods that even the smallest forces, those that seem insignificant or unnoticed, have the power to shape the world. The gods now knew that the quiet god's power was not in his ability to force change, but in his ability to let things flow naturally, to allow life to unfold in its own time. He had shown them that true strength was not in control, but in surrendering to the natural order of things. And so, as the gods watched over the world, no longer striving for control, they were at peace. They had learned that the quiet god's most valuable lesson was one that transcended their divine status, that the smallest forces are often the most powerful, and that balance, not domination, is the key to true power. The gods now understood their place in the universe, and they embraced it, knowing that they were not its masters, but its stewards. In the quiet god's absence, they had finally found their true strength. In the quiet aftermath of the god's transformation, something remarkable began to occur in the mortal world. It was as if the changes in Olympus, the gods' new understanding of their place in the universe, were starting to ripple through the earth, affecting all living things. The influence of the quiet god, though still unseen, was now everywhere. It wasn't a sudden, explosive change, but rather a gradual shift, like the steady turning of a river's current, pushing the course of history in a direction no one could have anticipated, as the gods began to embrace their new roles. No longer seeking dominance or control, the mortals below began to notice something new. The world felt calmer, more harmonious, as if the very fabric of life had been restored to its natural rhythm. There were no more harsh storms, no more plagues of suffering sent by the gods in their anger. Instead, there was a quiet, steady sense of order, a sense that everything was where it was meant to be. Mortals, often at the mercy of the gods' whims, now found themselves experiencing life in a way that felt balanced, not dictated. They still looked up to the heavens, but now it was with a sense of reverence, not fear. The gods, it seemed, had changed. They no longer exerted their power over the lives of mortals as if they were mere puppets. Instead, they had learned to trust the natural forces that had always been a part of the world, forces that worked quietly behind the scenes, shaping the course of events in ways no one could understand. It was as though the quiet god had turned the key to a door that had always been locked, revealing a world where everything could exist in balance without divine intervention. Even the seasons seemed to change in a more orderly fashion, as though the gods had finally understood their rhythm. The harvests flourished, the animals grew strong, and the lands once plagued by droughts began to thrive again. Life, for the first time in centuries, felt like it was unfolding in the way it was always meant to. And while the gods of Olympus took a step back, leaving mortals to live their lives with more autonomy, they still watched over them, not as rulers, but as gentle guardians. They knew now that their greatest strength was not in domination, but in the quiet guidance they could offer when needed. The mortal realm, too, felt the quiet god's influence, even though they would never fully understand it. The subtle shift was not only a divine change, but one that permeated every living thing. It was like the unseen hand of fate guiding them, leading them toward a future they could not predict. And so, the mortals, free from the gods' constant interference, began to build their own stories, shaping their own destinies, and finding their own paths to follow. The gods, too, had found their place in this new world. No longer did they rule from their thrones, nor did they look down upon the mortal realm as something to be controlled. They had learned, through the quiet god's subtle lessons, that true power wasn't in force, but in balance. It wasn't in bending the world to your will, but in understanding and respecting the natural forces that govern it. The quiet god had shown the gods that their strength lay not in their ability to command, but in their ability to let go and allow the world to unfold on its own. Even now, the gods no longer demanded temples or sacrifices in their honor. The mortals still honored them in their own way, but no longer did the gods expect worship. They had learned, through their struggles and failures, that their place in the universe was not to be worshipped, but to be a part of the greater whole. The quiet god had shown them this, though they could never repay him for the wisdom he had given them. He had given them the ultimate gift, the ability to see beyond themselves and their own desires. The gods now realized that they were not the center of the universe, but a part of something far greater. They understood that their true power lay in working together with the forces around them, in cooperation, not domination. And so, with this new understanding, the gods found peace. They watched over the world, but they no longer sought to control it. They no longer interfered with the lives of mortals unless absolutely necessary. They had learned to trust the natural order of things. The quiet god had, in the end, achieved what no other god could. He had brought balance to the universe. The gods, for the first time, saw that true strength was not in their ability to overpower, but in their ability to let the world be as it was meant to be. Even now, his influence still lingered, though no one could see it. Like the wind, he moved silently through the world, unseen but always present. His legacy lived on in the peace that now reigned in the world, a peace that was not born of force, but of understanding. The gods had been taught the hardest lesson of all, that the most powerful forces are often the ones you cannot see, and that true power lies not in control, but in letting go. In this new age, the gods could finally rest, knowing that they were no longer the masters of the world, but its humble guardians, watching over a universe that was finally at peace. And the quiet God, forever in the shadows, continued to guide the balance of the world, his work never finished, but his influence everlasting. As the gods of Olympus sat in their thrones, no longer burdened by their overwhelming need to control, the mortal realm flourished in a way that had never been seen before. The quiet God, whose influence had once been dismissed as insignificant, had become the true architect of this peace. His guidance was now subtly embedded into every corner of existence, though no one truly understood it. It's a strange thing, isn't it? The way something so vital can go unnoticed until it's no longer there. The gods no longer tried to force their will upon the world. Instead, they accepted the natural flow of life, understanding that their role was not to impose, but to nurture. They watched the mortals below, who, free from the gods' constant intervention, began to live more freely, shaping their own destinies. It was like the gods had handed over the reins to the mortals, trusting them to follow their own paths, knowing that the balance of the world had been restored, and the guiding hand of the quiet God was ever present, even if unseen. There was something profoundly beautiful in that realization. It wasn't just the gods who had changed. The mortals had, too. They had learned, in their own way, that the world didn't belong to the gods, nor was it to be bent to their will. The quiet God's influence had shaped their understanding as well, guiding them toward a more harmonious existence. They began to understand the importance of the unseen forces, the quiet winds that whispered through the trees, the unseen connections that bound them together. They realized that they were not separate from the gods, but part of the same tapestry of existence. It was like when you suddenly realize that everything in your life has led you to this very moment, and the world seems to make sense in a way it never has before. The gods had, for the first time, embraced their true role not as rulers of the world, but as stewards, protectors of a delicate balance that could so easily be disrupted. It was as if they had learned that their strength did not lie in their thunderbolts or their divine wisdom, but in their ability to listen and understand. They had learned the quiet God's lesson that the greatest power lies in letting go, in trusting the forces around you, and in understanding that you are but one part of a much larger whole. This newfound understanding changed the gods' relationship with the mortal world forever. They were no longer the distant, aloof figures of myth, pulling the strings of fate. They were now the quiet watchers, content in their roles as protectors of a world that no longer belonged solely to them. Mortals, in turn, began to live their lives with a newfound sense of purpose, free from the constant fear of divine punishment or favor. They understood that the gods were not to be feared, but respected, and that the forces they had once taken for granted were the ones that truly governed the world. And still, the quiet God remained in the background, his work never finished, yet never acknowledged. His role was to maintain the balance, to ensure that the natural forces of the world continued to flow without interference. He had no need for temples, no need for worship. His influence was enough. Imagine it, the quiet God, watching from the shadows, content in his role, knowing that the world had finally learned its lesson. He had no desire for glory, no need for recognition. His power lay not in domination, but in subtlety. And in that subtlety, he had shaped the course of history in ways no other god ever could. The gods of Olympus, too, had learned their place. They no longer sought to outshine one another, no longer struggled for dominance. They had learned to live in harmony, understanding that their power was not absolute. They were part of a much larger whole, and their true strength lay in their ability to respect the delicate balance of the world. It's almost as if they had been reborn, their former arrogance replaced by a humility they had never known. Their reign was not one of control, but one of cooperation. The gods, once so separate, now stood together, united in their understanding of the world's true nature. And through it all, the quiet god, whose name would never be spoken aloud, continued his work, watching over the world, ensuring that balance was maintained. His role was not one of glory, but of quiet importance. He was the thread that connected everything, the force that held the universe together, unseen and undetected by most. His work was never finished, but he did not need it to be. Like the wind, his influence moved through the world without fanfare, a constant, silent presence that kept the world in motion. And as the gods learned to live in harmony with the natural forces, they too found peace. They understood that true strength came not from dominating the world, but from recognizing the importance of every subtle force that made it work. They had learned the quiet god's lesson, and in doing so, they had found their true power. As the gods of Olympus continued to embrace this new era of understanding, the mortal realm, too, felt the effects of the quiet god's influence. What began as a subtle shift in the heavens had trickled down to the earth, spreading across the lives of those who had once been caught in the god's relentless drama. The mortals, no longer subject to the whimsy and chaos of divine intervention, were now able to chart their own courses, their actions and destinies no longer defined by the fear of divine retribution. The gods no longer cast down their thunderbolts, or withheld their blessings with such arbitrary force. Instead, there was a newfound sense of balance in the world, a sense of natural rhythm that allowed things to unfold in their own time. It wasn't as though the gods had stopped paying attention to the mortal world, but their approach had changed. They had learned, through the quiet god's guidance, that true leadership came not through domination, but through understanding. They no longer needed to control every aspect of existence. Instead, they guided it gently, like the stars that guided travelers by night, subtle but always present, always dependable. The quiet god, though unseen, had done something remarkable. He had shown both gods and mortals alike that power was not something to be hoarded or displayed. It was something that required patience and trust. He had set into motion a new way of life, one in which the forces of the universe worked in harmony, each piece contributing to the greater whole without exerting itself over the others. The gods, now, with their newfound humility, saw the world as it truly was, a vast, interconnected web of existence, where every action had a ripple effect. Each god, once so confident in their ability to control everything from the heavens to the seas, now understood that they were simply one part of the puzzle, and that puzzle was not something to be solved by brute force. The gods had learned to let go. They had learned to allow the world to flow naturally, understanding that sometimes the best thing you can do is step back and let the universe take its course. It was in that very surrender that they found their strength. In the mortal realm, this shift was no less profound. Mortals, once caught in the constant tug-of-war between the gods, now began to live their lives without fear of the divine. The world felt quieter, less chaotic, as though a great weight had been lifted from the shoulders of humankind. No longer were they subject to the whims of angry gods or the capricious nature of divine favor. They were free to live, to choose their paths, and to build their own destinies. The quiet God, though he never sought recognition or glory, had subtly guided them into this freedom. His influence, like the quiet hum of the earth beneath their feet, had always been there, supporting them, though they had never noticed it. And so, as the world began to flourish in this new harmony, the gods found peace not in their power over the mortal realm, but in their ability to allow the world to be as it was meant to be. They had been taught the most profound lesson of all, that true strength lies not in control, but in respect for the world around you and for the forces that govern it. The quiet God, forever in the background, had woven his influence into the fabric of the universe, and in doing so, he had shown everyone that the most powerful forces are often the ones that go unnoticed. The gods, once so blind to this, had now become part of that delicate web, no longer seeing themselves as above it, but as integral pieces within it. They had learned to trust the quiet God's wisdom, and in doing so, they had unlocked a peace they had never thought possible. The mortal realm, too, was changing. The gods no longer interfered with their every move. Instead, they watched, their once mighty thrones now humbled by the realization that mortals, too, had a part to play in the grand design of the universe. The world no longer felt like a battlefield between gods and mortals, but a place where every living thing had a role to play, and all were connected by the same unseen forces. The quiet God's absence was now more present than ever. His power lay not in his actions, but in his absence of presence that could not be seen, but was deeply felt by all. It was as if the very essence of the universe had shifted, becoming more harmonious, more balanced. The gods had learned to respect the natural order, to let go of their need to control, and in doing so, they had found something far more valuable than power: peace. It was a peace that spread through Olympus, through the mortal world, and even through the very elements that had once been subject to divine manipulation. The winds now blew with purpose, the oceans ebbed and flowed in their natural rhythm, and the seasons came and went without interference. The world was no longer a place of turmoil, but of quiet, steady growth. Mortals lived with a renewed sense of freedom, no longer beholden to the gods' whims, and the gods themselves found solace in the knowledge that they were no longer the masters of the world, but its guardians, its humble participants. And through it all, the quiet God's influence remained. A reminder that the greatest forces are often the ones that cannot be seen or measured, but only felt. In his silence, he had shaped the world. In his absence, he had brought peace. The gods, finally understanding the depth of his lesson, now saw that they were part of something far greater than themselves, a universe where every piece was connected, and every force, no matter how small, played a vital role. As time passed, the gods of Olympus adjusted to their new roles as humble guardians, no longer striving for dominance, but embracing their place in the grand design. The shift they had undergone, from rulers to participants, was profound, but not without its challenges. You see, the gods, as powerful as they were, had spent millennia accustomed to being the center of all things. They had reveled in their grandeur, each one vying for more power, more worship, more acknowledgement. Now, with their roles reshaped by the quiet God's subtle influence, they found themselves navigating a new existence. It was like an old king stepping down from the throne, not out of weakness, but out of wisdom, realizing that true strength lies not in sitting above others, but in understanding your part in a much larger story. And this was the real magic that the quiet god had brought to Olympus. Not just a change in the gods' understanding of themselves, but a deeper, more profound understanding of the interconnectedness of all things. The gods were not above the mortals, they were part of a living, breathing universe, woven together with the same invisible threads that connected all of existence. It's like when you first realize that the earth doesn't just revolve around the sun, but is part of an entire cosmic dance. The gods began to see the universe in a new light. Everything from the smallest grain of sand to the largest star played a role in the delicate balance that held the world together, and they, too, were a part of that balance, no longer standing apart but moving with the currents of fate. This realization wasn't immediate, nor was it easy for the gods. They had to unlearn years of arrogance, years of thinking they were untouchable, that they were separate from the world they governed. But with the quiet god's influence still lingering in the air, they slowly accepted this new truth. And with this acceptance came a new kind of peace, a peace not born from their power, but from their ability to work with the forces that had always existed beyond their control. The gods no longer fought to be at the top of the pyramid. They were content to be part of the structure, knowing that their influence, though great, was not absolute. They found their peace not in dominance, but in the gentle guidance of the forces that shaped the world. The quiet god had taught them that true power was in respecting the balance of nature, in understanding that nothing in this world or beyond it could ever be completely controlled. And as the gods adapted to this new understanding, they found that they could still have an impact on the world, but it was no longer through force or control. Instead, their influence was felt in the quiet moments, the subtle shifts that changed the course of events. Imagine it like a whisper that grows louder, not through shouting, but through a gentle persistence that draws people's attention. The gods' actions, once grand and dramatic, were now more measured, more deliberate. They understood that their power wasn't meant to be wielded recklessly, but with care, like a gardener tending to a delicate plant. Their role was to nourish the world, not command it. And so, they watched as the mortal realm flourished, free from the fear of their arbitrary whims. Mortals still revered the gods, but now it was a reverence born from mutual respect, not fear. They understood that the gods were not there to dictate their lives, but to guide them when needed. And in that understanding, a new relationship blossomed between the gods and the mortals, one where both played vital roles in the ongoing cycle of life. The quiet god, watching from the shadows, was at peace. He had never sought to be worshipped, never desired recognition. His role was never to be the center of attention. Instead, it was to be the silent force that kept everything in motion, guiding the universe without ever needing to be acknowledged. And so, the gods began to understand that their actions, no matter how small, had an impact on the world around them. They didn't need to conquer or control, but to nurture and guide. Their newfound humility was the key to their strength, and in their ability to let go, they found a power that was greater than any they had ever known. The quiet god's lesson was clear. The greatest power comes from understanding your place in the universe and respecting the forces that move it. The gods had learned to live in harmony with these forces, and in doing so, they had unlocked a peace that would last for eons. As for the quiet god, he continued to move through the world, never seen, but always present. His work was never truly done, for the balance of the universe was an ongoing process. But he had brought peace to Olympus, and in that peace, the gods had found their true strength. It wasn't in their thunderbolts or their wisdom, but in their ability to respect the world, and all that it encompassed. The quiet God had shown them the way, and in doing so, he had left an indelible mark on the gods, the mortals, and the very fabric of existence itself. And though his name may never be remembered, his influence would echo through the ages, shaping the world for all time. In the final chapter of this story, as you lay here, wrapped in the warmth of the night and the quiet hum of the world around you, the legacy of the quiet God still lingers, like a soft echo in the deepest corners of existence. The gods of Olympus, once so full of pride and arrogance, had come to a full understanding of their place in the universe, and the world they watched over had changed in ways no one could have imagined. The quiet God's lesson had not only reshaped the gods' understanding of themselves, but it had also touched every living thing. Mortals, who had once lived in fear of the gods, had learnt to embrace their own power in a world that was no longer defined by divine whims. They had found their freedom, their ability to shape their own futures, and with it, a new sense of purpose. This was the true gift the quiet God had given to the world, the ability to live in balance. Not in fear of the gods, but in harmony with the forces of nature that governed them all. The gods, too, had learned that their true strength lay in their ability to guide without controlling, to nurture without demanding. They had come to understand that they were not the center of existence, but a part of the greater whole. Their role was not to impose their will, but to serve as guardians of the delicate balance that held the universe together. It was a subtle shift, but one that had profound consequences for both the divine and the mortal realms. The quiet God, though never truly acknowledged in the way the other gods were, had fulfilled his purpose. His absence had been his greatest gift by showing the gods and mortals alike that the most powerful forces are often the ones that go unnoticed, that the world is not governed by loud declarations and grand gestures, but by the quiet persistence of unseen forces working in tandem. He had shown them that true power lies not in control, but in understanding and respecting the natural order. His influence was felt in every whisper of the wind, every rustle of the leaves, every ripple in the water. It was a power that was felt, not seen, a power that had always been there, quietly shaping the world in ways no one could understand. And now, as the gods settled into their new understanding, they watched over the world with a sense of peace and humility they had never known before. They had learned to let go of their need to control, to accept their place in the grand design, and to work in harmony with the forces that shaped everything. The mortal world, too, flourished. Mortals no longer lived in fear of the gods. They no longer believed that their lives were at the mercy of the gods' capricious whims. Instead, they saw the gods as gentle guides, watching over them but no longer controlling them. They had found their freedom, their own agency in a world that had once been ruled by divine chaos. And all the while, the quiet God continued his work, his influence still woven into the fabric of the universe, ever present, ever subtle. He had no need for recognition, no desire for glory. His role was never one of conquest or domination. He was the keeper of balance, the silent hand that guided the flow of existence. His work would never be finished, for the balance of the world was an ongoing process, a delicate dance that required constant attention. But in the peace that had settled over Olympus and the mortal realm, the quiet God knew that his influence had made a difference. It was not in the loud, thunderous battles between gods, nor in the grand displays of power. It was in the quiet moments, the subtle shifts, the unseen forces that worked behind the scenes. It was in the balance that had been restored, in the recognition that no god, no mortal, could truly control the world. Instead, they were all part of it, each playing their role, each respecting the forces that guided them. The gods of Olympus had learned that their power was not in their ability to dominate, but in their ability to coexist with the natural forces that governed the world. And the mortal realm too had learned that they were not at the mercy of the gods, but that they, too, had a part to play in the grand design. The quiet god had shown them all that the greatest power comes not from controlling everything, but from letting go and allowing life to unfold in its own time. And so, as the gods of Olympus settled into their new roles, as humble participants in the world, they knew that the quiet god's work was never truly done. His influence would continue to guide them, silently shaping the course of events, quietly, ensuring that the balance was maintained. He was the unseen force that kept everything in motion, the gentle whisper in the wind that would never be heard but always felt. And as for the world itself, it continued on, ever changing, ever evolving, in a delicate balance that could only be maintained by the quiet god's unseen hand. His legacy lived on, not in temples or altars, but in the very fabric of existence, itself in the forces that shaped the world and held it together. The gods of Olympus, in their wisdom, had learned that true power lay not in control, but in respect for the natural order, and in that respect they had found their peace.